and indeed elections in Zimbabwe. As the title says, Stampede to the 2020 elections. Is history about to repeat itself? I think before I hand over to our very distinguished panel, that includes two professors, Professor Jonathan Moyo, Professor Arthur Mutambara, I'd like to make maybe a few observations that might act as a conversation starter for our webinar today. And certainly in the concept note that we shared as part of the invitation to this seminar, the point has been made that it appears that nothing seems to divide Zimbabwe and lead to violence, bloodshed, and in many instances, international condemnation than elections. And indeed, when we track this phenomenon, as was noted by Dr. Mandaza, our convener, in his opening, we note that in 2000, the election was rejected by the Commonwealth Observer Group. And in 2002, it led to Zimbabwe being suspended from the Commonwealth itself. The election in 2008 led to the imposition of an inclusive government, which seemed at the time, and even with hindsight and historical perspective, not to have delivered the kind of democratic outcomes that we would have anticipated. And of course, most recently in 2018, there was another election that seemed to be nothing more than an attempt to cure what appears to have been a coup in Zimbabwe. This also has led to international condemnation in recent times. But the interesting aspect about this is that since the end of British colonial rule, and when we observe Zimbabwean elections since 1980, it's interestingly kept its obligation to hold regular elections, which almost negates the question that is raised by our convener, which is that of, are we seeing history repeating itself? Because in many instances, history says that Zimbabwe has indeed held elections on a regularized basis.
No.
One of the sticking features of this is, however, that ZANU-PF appears to have used multiple strategies to manipulate these elections and remain in power, despite the creation and emergence of a popular opposition in the movement for democratic change. So in this instance, by looking towards elections again in 2023, are we not simply setting up Zimbabwe for the sort of condemnation that has emerged from these elections, the electoral manipulation that has been what appears to be the stock in trade, in particular, of the governing party, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, and the use, of course, of coercion in the form of violence, very cleverly engineered electoral manipulation in recent times has been noted. And I think the exclusion of rural areas as an active area of competitive electoral politics, with what might be seen by some to be controversial points around elections in Zimbabwe, I'd like to hand over to Professor Jonathan Moyo to allow him to give us to provide us with about 25 minutes of his observations and opening remarks. This will be followed by Professor Arthur Mutambara, who will also be given similarly 25 minutes. And then we'll give our discussants 5 minutes each to respond to the panel today. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your very provocative remarks. It's tempting that I start by responding to you, but I will not follow that temptation. May I also thank SAPES and Dr. Mandaza for inviting me and for hosting this regular platform, which is contributing immensely to state politics in our country. Chris says that I have 25 minutes to make my observations, but the conveners gave me 30 minutes. You are already rigging the panel. Well, the question is a very timely one. What I'm not sure about is whether the aspect of a stampede is visible. I don't think that there is any stampede towards election 2023. In fact, what we see in the body politic is palpable fear on the part of ZANU-PF and Douglas Munzora's MDCT, two major players in the formal sector. A serious fear of elections. I mean, they are afraid of by-elections. If you see a by-election, you will be double afraid of a general election. So there's some question about the stampede aspect. However, the part which I think is the more important part as to whether history is about to repeat itself is timely, is very serious, and I think it is the most serious question. And I don't think the question is whether or not Zimbabwe has been formally holding elections when they are due, but whether when Zimbabwe holds elections, it holds free and fair elections that with a result which is accepted by all, if it's not the majority of the participants. That is the question. Is history of election rigging about to repeat itself? And I think this question is best answered by looking at 10 key variables, 5 which speak to the background of the elections, where we are now. Are there features development in the body politic, which if we look at them, give us concern that this might be about to repeat itself? Then I will also proffer 5 electoral dynamics which accompany or usually accompany every general election. And I will suggest that there is a need to focus on those dynamics because how they play out will, to a very large extent, determine whether history, if not about to repeat itself, will repeat itself as we get into the active part of the election season. So I start with 5 very important background variables, which I believe are very important to determine this question of whether history is about to repeat itself or it will in fact repeat itself. The first one, obviously, an important starting point, has to do with the illegitimacy of the state. And the illegitimacy of the state arising from 3 aspects of the state, key aspect of the state. It is common cause that the 2018 presidential election produced a disputed result. And then I believe, and I say so as one of those who actually took a careful look at that election and studied it, that we can say, as we sit here, that it's a fact, a documented fact. I know some of our citizens have a problem with a proven fact, but it is a documented fact that the 2018 presidential election was stolen. Now, if you are about to go into another election against the background of a stolen previous election unresolved, nothing having been done about that election, then it stands to reason. It's rational to say the possibility of history repeating itself is very high. But not only do we have a legitimacy crisis, a crisis of legitimacy engulfing the executive arm of government, but also the judiciary, even presented with compelling evidence. The judiciary chose to look elsewhere and endorse what was an irregularly conducted election by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and left the judiciary in crisis. And the judiciary has gone deeper into that crisis by its involvement in the party politics, the politics of the major parties, MDCA and ZANU-PF, notably through the controversial and dubious 31st of March 2020 Supreme Court judgment, which had two implications that clearly affect whether or not the next election will be history repeating itself. One, that judgment inexplicably ordered the restructuring of the MDC alliance and the restructuring by holding an extraordinary Congress in 2020 on the basis of 2014 structures to elect the successor to the late Morgan Tsvangirai. An incredible kind of judgment that today restructure yourself on the basis of yesterday. It's a very difficult politics. But as we have seen with the development around the constitutional court decision on constitutional amendment number 1, that judgment, which sought to restructure the MDCA, has also had the consequence of restructuring the third arm of government, which has previously not been part of the wrangles, the political wrangles of the day, as we are now seeing. That is Parliament. The judgment has been used to effect recalls, which recalls have resulted in the restructuring of the composition of Parliament, so that the ruling party, which did not have 2/3 majority to make constitutional amendments, finds itself with that 2/3, thanks to the judgment in general, and in particular, the support of that judgment by the MDCT. So this now, it is without question that what is happening in Parliament, what is happening in the judiciary, at the behest of the executive, will determine whether history will repeat itself. If we look at it today, objectively, clearly, history is about to repeat itself. Second, what will determine this issue will also, to a large extent, depends on who controls 3 Fs. The politics or the political economy of Zimbabwe in general, but electoral politics in particular, are influenced by 3 Fs: food, forex, and fuel. And who controls those 3 will, to a large extent, influence the or decide the important question of the 2, namely whether the election will be history repeating itself in terms of rigging. And this is particularly important this time round, because while traditionally these 3 Fs have been controlled by the top 4 counters in the Zimbabwean stock exchange, Old Mutual, Delta, Insco, and Econet, EcoCash, now they are controlled by cartels, which have emerged since the coup. And all the cartels are very much connected with the state and ZANU-PF. The third background variable, which I have already alluded to, is that generally in terms of the law, the election is a rule-bound political process which ends up as a legal event. And because it is a legal event that is supposed to be conducted in terms of the law, starting with the Constitution and of course, then the Electoral Act, the outcome of an election is presumed to be valid. And it's whoever thinks that it has not been so, who has the burden to prove otherwise. But Zimbabwean elections since 1980 have always had a disputed outcome, such that now an important presumption that must accompany any and every Zimbabwean election until there's a fundamental change is the presumption of rigging. It is rational now to presume that every general election will be rigged because previous elections have been surrounded by allegations of rigging. And when we look at the 5 dynamics that are very important, which look at the election itself, what will define it, I will point to 1 or 2 very critical areas that those who are participating in the election need to look at. But the last, which is the 5th background variable that is very important for us to look at and is currently very active, is the consequence of the coup, the consequence of the military coup. The 2013 election, the major background variable that affected that election was the 2008 election and the GNU government. The 2018 election, the major background variable that shaped it was the coup. The 2023 election, the major background variable that's going to shape it are the consequences of the coup. And in particular, with respect to 4 things that are now playing out in the body politics of the country. Number 1, a major consequence and a very serious one at that of the coup has been the depoliticization of the public sphere, as it were the depoliticization of politics. There was quite some robust, very active political participation in the run-up to the coup. Zimbabwe, in the run-up to the coup, was a laboratory for real politics. After the coup, there has been a very systematic program by the state, in particular by the securocrats, to shift politics from the everyday engagement and contestation to a security-driven process where now fear grips the nation. And what the state prefers is that the citizens become apolitical or even non-political. Everyone must now be a good citizen, and the idea of a good citizen is what you find being prescribed in the impending, soon-to-be gazetted patriotic bill. The state does not want citizens to engage in political life. The state does not want citizens to exercise their political rights, and political rights being the most fundamental rights that informed the struggle for independence. Also, related to that has been the demobilization and immobilization of the opposition in general, but the MDCA in particular. This whole issue about the Supreme Court judgment, the recalls, attacking not just parliament, but also councils, taking away the funding that the MDC is entitled to constitutionally by virtue of its performance in the 2018 election, taking its head office and targeting certain activists within the MDC or associated with the MDC. All that is designed to demobilize them politically and render them unable to act, and therefore immobilizing them. You cannot rationally project a free and fair election against the background of a demobilized and immobilized opposition. And this is being done not by ZANU-PF. This is being done by the securocrats in terms of their joke contest, but in particular, this is being done by the CIO. Mnangagwa is not an army guy. He tries to present himself as a soldier, but he is actually a CIO guy. CIO is his politics, and the use of CIO to demobilize and paralyze the MDCA is active, and therefore raises concerns as to whether this will not facilitate history to repeat itself. But because of demobilization, we also see now a major consequence of the coup, which is that ZANU-PF is no longer a political organization. ZANU-PF is absent from the political scene, conspicuously absent. And no one in ZANU-PF is doing or saying anything of political significance. They are traumatized. I have said they actually are behaving like people who are in a trauma center. They are not behaving as politicians. And it is very instructive to look at what is happening in ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF structures are conspicuous by their non-political activity. And this is a direct consequence of the coup. And lastly, the civil society has been paralyzed by the coup. One unfortunate consequence of the coup is that the civil society is in hiding. It is in a state of paralysis. Partly it's because there was a mobilization of everybody during or in the run-up to the coup, but partly it's because that's what happens in a military state. If you want to see the evidence of Zimbabwe as a military state, look at how the civil society is engaging, look at how the ruling party is engaging, look at how the state has systematically attacked the opposition, and all that adds up to a depoliticized state. Now, against this background of these 5 variables, which in my view are the best indicators as to whether history is about to repeat itself ahead of the 2023 elections, we need to look very quickly at the elections themselves, at what defines the election. And there are 5 dynamics that are very important if we are going to have a meaningful debate on this one. First of all, and these are parts, if you will, you can look at this as parts that define an election. First of all, you have the pre-election period. When you get into what is the pre-election period, you start a pre-election campaign. And what are the 2 major benchmarks of the pre-election campaign? The most important one is voter registration. On the 9th of December 2020, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission announced publicly that it had started what it called a massive voter registration exercise. And what was underlined in that message was massive voter registration exercise. And then it said it has started that massive voter registration exercise in order to prepare or commence the delimitation exercise. That is the delimitation of constituencies. We had expected the delimitation to be linked to the census, and we know that is not going on. So ZEC, in fact, is in charge of both the delimitation and on the basis of a voter registration exercise. Now, if you look at the major platforms that express politics in Zimbabwe, you will not get the impression that there is a massive voter registration exercise going on in Zimbabwe. And yet this is very important for the next election. Whether or not that election is going to be free will depend in the first instance whether we have in fact had an appropriate voter registration exercise, and in particular, how that voter registration exercise has affected the delimitation process. There's quite some reasonable grounds to be concerned that certain provinces, and certainly those in Matabele land, are at risk of losing constituencies. And the excuse that will be used will be the voter registration exercise. Some urban constituencies are definitely going to lose constituencies, or some urban areas, urban towns, centers, are definitely going to lose constituencies to rural centers under the guise of voter registration exercise. Now, what is the most important issue there? The most important issue is, of course, the voters' roll. And an election, when all is said and done, is a voters' roll. He who controls the voters' roll decides the election. It is quite instructive that while this has started as we speak right now, you don't see the kind of political opposition party and civic society and others participating in the exercise to get people to go and register to vote. Yes, we are seeing quite some interesting and I would say helpful messages on social media platforms, but they are not really very useful if they are not connected to what is happening in the streets, the blocks, and what is happening in the villages. The voter registration expresses itself at a polling station level, the polling station-based voters roll. And unless somebody begins to come up with a voter registration campaign that ties all the noise that we are hearing with what is actually happening on the ground, then observers should have good reason to fear that history will repeat itself. Because the one thing that the state has succeeded in the negative sense of the term to control and manipulate is the voters' roll. And the opposition up to this point has not shown the capacity to understand the implications of the voters' roll. You've got to start focusing on the voters' roll now, the voters' roll for 2023. You don't wait until the voters' roll is closed and you are invited to inspect it, and then you start making noise. You should actually have your own parallel voters' roll with the number of people you expect to come out. Then the next thing, which is very important, is the election campaign that is coming. The election campaign starts when the nomination court sit and approve candidates as well as election symbols and so forth. Now, a lot of people in Zimbabwe, political parties in particular, wait until that time. When the voters registration exercise starts right now, you should also anticipate the election campaign. And the most important aspect of that election campaign is the selection of candidates. Political parties that wait for the nomination court process to select candidate assist in the materialization of the fear of history, the fear being expressed by this topic of history repeating itself. Because then they would have missed a lot of stuff. What it means in the Zimbabwean case is you must have 1,958 candidates for local authorities. They are very important. You must have them today and start organizing around them, because if you have 1,958 local authority candidates today, you are covering the whole electoral map. And that is the most important part, because that is where the V11s are generated. Those are the people around whom you can start building other capacities. Those are the people you can link to resident associations, burial societies, community-based organizations, village communities and village committees and so forth. If you wait for the nomination court to come up with your 1,958, then you've missed the boat in terms of your own ambition to win an election, but you are also contributing to the possibility of history that has been witnessed over the last 20 years, repeating itself. But you also must have your 210 MP candidates, especially if you are opposition. And I dare say, especially if you are MDCA, one thing that can be done to get Monzora to run for his money right now, and other people who are entertaining remaining with him, especially sitting MPs, is for the MDCA to start saying it is now working with communities to select candidates for constituencies. It's very, very important. And if you have those candidates for constituencies as well as for local authorities now, as opposed to when the nomination courts sit, you will have played an important role. Third, you must focus on voting, the voting period, voting days. And there's lots to do there, but the one important thing that must happen now, which has implications on the voting day, is the creation, not the selection, but the creation of polling agents pool, a pool for polling agents. It is impossible for any opposition party anywhere in the world, let alone Zimbabwe, to win an election without competent polling agents. It's just impossible. This idea of waiting until the nomination court sits, waiting until donors start telling you how much they have for polling agents, and you end up just picking fly-by-night characters, and you even end up not being able to fill the polling agents in a number of constituencies, is very problematic. We know that in 2018, there were 10,985 polling stations, and each one of those polling stations needed at least 4 polling agents. And we know that many of them, at least 500, did not have, for the MDC that is, did not have polling agents. And when you are in that situation, the securocrats, they laugh, they go and buy their whiskey, they say, Zedu Zaita, Zafamba, Basatarova, and they will start looking at those particular polling stations. We saw some very funny stuff that was happening in Makoni North, for example, where there were no polling agents, and ZEC people, or people who were wearing ZEC regalia, were sitting under trees filling V11 forms on their own and putting them in the boxes. So that is very, very critical. The next thing in that chain is vote counting. Now, we really need to pause in this discussion if we are serious about interrogating the question of whether history will repeat itself. I invite you colleagues to pay particular attention to what happens during vote counting. That's where rigging takes place. Zimbabweans, at least those I encounter who talk to me on Twitter and so forth, keep asking me, if for us to take you serious, show us how elections are rigged in Zimbabwe. Some say that, others say, Joyce Mjuru, Ditmas Mtasa, Rugare Gumbo, Sevia Kasukwere, Joao, Jonathan Moyo, you left ZANU-PF, but a long time ago. But we think you have not left ZANU-PF, and the evidence of that is you are not telling us how the elections are stolen. And they say that expecting that somehow there are some mafia-like, movie-like ways that are used to steal the election. No. One of the things that has happened in Zimbabwe over the 20 or so, or rather over the 40, quite frankly, years, but over the last elections, the studies, I started studying elections in Zimbabwe in 1985 with Professor Masipula Stole. There has been no election that has not been surrounded by allegations of rigging, even when the competition is not stiff as happened in 1995. None. The system has been learning, moving away from certain obvious ways of intimidation, like that stuff of a car getting crashed and saying, this is one way to die, another way is to vote ZANU-PF. Those things are less and less. The deep state among the securocrats are perfecting it, and the major focus of ZEC rigging is in vote counting. And you need to look at two things. There's one thing they call, when they count the votes after they have sorted them out, the valid ballot and so forth, and then it's now serious business, and they know which candidates are there. What they do is they start by saying, we will now put your votes. You will have a pile here for you and a pile there for another guy. Then they will say, we will transform these piles into lots. And a lot is 10 votes, 10 ballot papers for you. And then they will say, these lots, we will then transform them into bundles, ballot bundles. And a bundle is 100 votes, which means it's 10 lots. So what do? They will start undercounting votes of the opponents, of the opposition. Instead of having 10, they can, for you, they will put 14, 15. And for the other guy, instead of putting 10, they will put 8, 7. And that's what happens. When we say we want to open boxes, as I did in 2013 after I lost in Cholocho, we would be saying we want to tear apart these lots and bundles. And invariably, whenever you do that, the numbers change. And it sounds mundane, but I assure you this is serious. For ZEC, this is the source of what they call miscounting. And this is the miscounting mischief that they did in Chegutu West. And I'm sure if the ballot boxes had been opened there, I don't know whether they are still there, they would have found more than one vote that was miscounted, because the miscounting is done in the manipulation of lots and of bundles. Now, I'm going to
Professor. Sorry, Prof. Really, we can only afford you maybe 2 more minutes to conclude because you're way over the allocated time now.
Yes, I hope these are two parliamentary minutes. I just want to conclude, as you say I must do, by mentioning something quite important relating to the counting, which is about the V forms. The V forms. There was such a circus created in 2018 about V11s, and an impression created that the election was about V11s. There are 5 different types of V11s. There's a V11, which is an election return for a polling station. It is only relevant for determining a councillor, the winner of a local authority at the ward level. And at the ward level, where these V11s are collected, a new form is generated, and that is a V23A form. And it collects all the results of a ward to determine the winner at the constituency level of the member of parliament. And at that level, the member of parliament's result are a collection of V23As, and the form for that is called a V23B form. And the same V23B form, a different one, is the one that has the presidential election result. It was preposterous that people ran around making noise about V11s, which determine a councillor, when they should have been running around making noise about V23Bs, which determine an MP, but also constitute the result of the presidential election in the constituency. And in terms of the law in Zimbabwe, the election is determined by adding together 210 V23B forms, not a V11. And a V11 becomes relevant if some questions emerge about what is in the V23B form. And you then start going backwards, looking at your V23A and your V11 form. Taken on its own, as we saw, it does not add to anything. And hopefully, when we go forward next time, there will be a shift from V11 to V23. Now, finally, just indulge me just for 1 minute. Where does this leave us? Zimbabwe has democratic electoral laws, but it doesn't have democratic electoral practice. What is important moving forward is to try and find creative ways of aligning political practice with the democratic laws. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for
Thank you so much, Professor Moyo. You really do paint a very compelling case that talks to the legitimacy or questions about the legitimacy of the state. And similarly, some of the components that are required to reform the state away from what you describe as an increasingly securitized state, where politics appears in and of itself to be anathema. Now, given that Professor has painted such a very dire and stark picture of the state of the electoral systems and indeed the electoral space in Zimbabwe, which in essence boils down to what we could describe as maybe the abrogation of the will of the people, we'll hand over now to Professor